the rector of the University of Dundee, and that great internationally acclaimed actor, Brian Cox.
Well, as we say in the theatre, follow that. Right. 1946, a momentous year, a year of fruition. In August of that year, in Edinburgh, there was the debut of the Edinburgh Festival. 2 months previous, at the DRI, Mary Ann, Gilliline, Cox, Nee McCann was going through one of the worst times of her life. She nearly died. She was in the process of giving birth, an agony, and her tiny incumbent was doing the best he could to make her life a misery by refusing to come into the world. And as a result, causing the woman such physical pain and havoc. The incumbent was a double breech birth, his arms firmly wrapped around his umbilical cord and his arse visibly pointing out to the oncoming light. And in that state, the incumbent was ejaculated into the world. And that incumbent was me. Back to Edinburgh. My first Edinburgh Festival was in 1963, 51 years ago. And I was completely overwhelmed by the scope of the artistry and the creation that abounded there. I remember vividly the Sortine and Modigliani exhibition, and I suppose it was the first major international revelation of my life. I was only 17. That there in the capital city were gathered these extraordinary artists. A drama conference was taking place at the McEwan Hall. There was this American guy called Jim Haynes, and he created these things called happenings, which seemed to turn traditional dramatic ideas on their head. There was a plethora and potpourri of artistic events, and you realized that great things were happening, and great things do happen in Edinburgh during the festival. They always have, and they always will. At the festival, we were viewing and questioning and interpreting the world we live in because of its inclusiveness. It is always Scottish, and it is always international. What an incredible inspiration Edinburgh is for the debate on our country's future and the decisions that we're about to take. It comes from the heart of our personal journey, but also from the heart of the very character of Scotland as a nation, personal, cultural, rational, the wealth of nations to dolly the sheep. And this evening, I'd like to explore with you my own personal journey to the position that I have come to on the future of our country. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because it demands absolute truth and honesty, and sometimes risks a great deal of embarrassment on my part, hence my birth. But the stakes are so high, it behooves me to have a go. Have a go at it. As I've gotten older, I've found it increasingly difficult to settle down. I mean, quite honestly, I don't know where I live. No, it's true. I mean, I have a flat in Brooklyn. I've just got a wee flat in London. I have a plethora of hotels here in Scotland, the Apex, thank God for it. And a pal's flat in Edinburgh, who's kind enough to put up with me. I think I'm the original peripatetic. But you know, it's been like that ever since I was a child. The first thing I remember about my house in Dundee is looking at the Tay and thinking, I'm going to cross that. Immediately, I wanted to move. As a 3-year-old, I was apparently so determined on exploring. One day I left the house and followed my dad to work. I mean, I had no idea where he worked and where it was, and as it happens, I'd only travelled to the bottom of the street, which was the junction between the Arbroath Road and Brown Constable Street, which is the street where I was born and grew up. The police found me and took me to Bell Street Station. I'd messed my pants. They cleaned me up, and there was this old wifey who was this sort of, she was the kind of concierge of the police station. She was very sweet to me. My dad collected me, And I'd caused my dad such grief. He said to me, he said, Brian, stay still. Stay still. You're too wee to be running about all over the place. But I suppose I could never stay still. I had a reasonably happy childhood, until sadly my father died when I was 8, and my mother had a severe mental breakdown and was confined for some time at the Liff Hospital, the Hospital for Nervous Disorders, where she received electric shock treatment and lost half her body weight. So, virtually from the age of 8, I was on my own. I had my sisters, who were wonderful, and still are a wonderful support in my life, but I don't think they could keep up with me. They still can't. One of my sisters is a no, by the way. We have to change her mind. I offered her to come here tonight. I said, Betty, are you coming tonight? I said, you know, I'm going to be in Dundee. Oh, yes, yes. Shall I come and see you? I said, yes, I'm talking on independence. Oh, well, Brian, I won't be coming. She is the last bastion. I think it's part of my heritage, this restlessness. Robert Louis Stevenson said, I travel not to go anywhere, but to go. The great affair is to move. And I think this is a peculiarly Celtic phenomenon. The Celts have been displaced from time immemorial. My ancestors came from Ireland. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was from Derry, and his wife was from Donegal, and their lives were pretty horrendous. I recently did a television program about my great-grandfather and discovered at the age of 39 he went into the poorhouse with his son Sam after losing his wife Margaret and 5 of his 8 children. He went in and out of the poorhouse for the next 14 years of his life, and he ended his days in the Gap Cautious Asylum, wandering the corridors, thinking that he was still a wee boy, a 14-year-old boy back in Derry. But in examining the lives of people at that time, which was the latter part of the 19th century, horrendousness did seem to be the order of the day. But the Cox side of my family came from Manor, where the famine started. And they were told, the famine's come, nae mair tides, get on the move. The townlands where they farmed consisted of 2 fields which couldn't support the whole family, so my forebears became itinerant workers, following the shifting potato and berry seasons here in the east coast of Scotland. And finally, at the time of famine and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, my family came to Dundee to work the jute mills. And it was the women that did all the work, all the spinning and the weaving, because they had the skills. The men didn't work, because there was no need for the men. And that's where the notion of the indolent Irish worker come from. I mean, these men were farmers. So the move from, they weren't naturally industrial, so the move from agrarian to industrial culture was quite a shock, even though it was a long time coming. And a sense of displacement suffered by the itinerant Irish and Scottish farming communities resulted in mass migration to America, to the industrial towns, the industrial heartland of Scotland. So people were on the move. But this has become a common theme. We're on the move, on the move, on the move again. Here we go, off again. Now this sense of restlessness has been with me all my life. This sense of wanting to go, to travel. And I've never really understood it. I remember when I was a young actor and I was working at the Lyceum and I was contemplating going to London to further my career, and one of the older actors said, "Oh, you shouldn't leave, son. This is your country. Stay here." But of course, I was programmed to get away. And then I started to think, why? Why am I part of this diaspora? Why is this part of my history? A history where we've been told, piss off. We don't need you anymore. And now, at the age of 68, I've come to a point in my personal history where perhaps, I don't have to be on the move anymore. Perhaps, as my father said when I was 2, it is time to stay still. Perhaps it is time to bring things to a point of home. The independent Scotland debate has shined a huge spotlight, and that's made me stop in my tracks and reconsider my peripatetic position, not just for myself, but for my forefathers. I think now it's time to stop being on the move. It's time to stop being on the run. Yes, on behalf of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and all my forefathers, all of our forefathers, it's time to stop. It's time to stop, consider and say, let's rethink. Let's think what our lives are and what our lives could be. Now, given the time to contemplate, I look to history, our history, personal history, and the history of our country. And I realize that history is meaning, and meaning is history. Deny history, you deny meaning. But with meaning comes a story, a narrative. The narrative of your life, my life, and it's that narrative that I want to try and pursue here tonight. I want to look at our history and our sense of wanting. What is an independent state? Why does one want an independent state? Is it necessary? Is it valid? Is it central to my life? Is it central to your life? I believe that it is central to my life. And it is something that I haven't really considered enough. I've been so caught up in the action of it that I've actually not considered the reason why. And the thing that haunts me quite a lot is a story about my great friend and mentor. And I'm sure you all remember the actor Fulton Mackay. Extraordinary man, great thinker, great philosopher, genius actor, tremendous painter, an all-round Renaissance man from Clydebank. But he suffered. Freely admitted on his behalf, he went into therapy, Freudian, then Jungian. And the source of his suffering was his identity. I remember him calling me just before he died and saying he'd made a breakthrough in one of his therapy sessions. He said, Brian, I think I can now speak in an English accent. And he felt liberated. But the other thing about Fulton was when he was a child, only 2, his mother died. She had diabetes, which in those days was fatal. And his father deposited him and his brother with his aunties and cousins in a house in Clydebank. And this was one of the great hurts throughout his life. He carried it with him till the day he died. It was when he was growing up and he would come home from school, his name wasn't on the front door. It was the name of his cousins, but it wasn't his name. And he said, I always felt disenfranchised in some way. My life was dependent on the kindness of strangers. He was living there with kindness, tremendous kindness, and he bore tremendous gratitude and love. It was all present, but his name wasn't on the front door. And I think that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about one's name on the front door. It's the key. It's the thing that makes you crudely realize who you are, who one is. It's the first source of our history, and it's immediately displaced. Now, I'm a diabetic, and when I came to be rector of Dundee University, the wonderful Andrew Morris, chief scientist of Scotland, and who we've recently lost to, he's become Dean of Medical Studies in Edinburgh. But he suggested I get myself a GP while I was in Dundee. And this was only 3 years ago. And a taxi whisked me off to a destination which I hadn't really taken in. When I got there, I realized it was the street I used to play on when I was wee, Arthurstone Terrace. And there was where we had been the Broadway Cinema, the Royal Cinema. Not there now, but it used to be there. My old haunting grounds, diagonally opposite one, my old church, St. Patrick's, the library, and my great playground, the Ironstone Foundry, which I used to spend hours playing in as a kid. And from the front of this GP's surgery, I could see my window on Brown Constable Street, where I first saw the light of day. And it hit me at that time. It just hit me. You're back with a vengeance. I was 65. And of course that kind of Damascus moment makes you think. My resistance as an actor has always been to avoid being stereotyped. Part of the reason I went to study in London was I wanted to learn to speak properly. I didn't want to be scarred with a similar inadequacy that Fulton thought he had 30 years later, when in his Damascus moment he could speak English, standard English. I intuitively wanted to avoid that, so I set myself on a particular course. I also felt that I could play anything. I mean, why should I be pigeonholed? It's something I've always tried to avoid. In the feudal world we live in, it happens all the time. Oh, he's this or she's that, and it sets up barriers. But of course, having been driven to avoid these barriers, you end up creating other barriers as to who you really are. And I'd like to take a moment to quote the great Scots philosopher, of more later too, of the Enlightenment period, David Hume, on this very issue. And he says, "Where am I, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence? And to what condition shall I return? I am confounded with all these questions, and beginning to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty." Now this quote is interesting and strangely reassuring to me, funnily enough. Reassuring in that it highlights the dilemma for the Scots, ongoing since the time of Union. Now, the original Union came about as a result of the insane religious wars of the 17th century. That and a combination of acts of God and self-inflicted wounds, such as the dethroning of the King James II of England and the 7th of Scotland, the Great Famine of 1688, when at its height 200,000 beggars roamed the glens of Scotland. And then William of Orange's complicit involvement in the massacre of Glencoe and his scuppering of the ill-equipped and ill-financed Darien scheme. The Scots bid to create a colony on the Darien Peninsula in South America. The 1707 Union happened because Scotland was exhausted, not just financially, but physically and spiritually. The game was a bogey. The ball was definitely on the net. We didn't get a say in the Union. Those in control made a decision based on self-interest. Did that leave Scotland, the nation, and the people with a hangover of regret? A country-sized hole that we sought to fill with the great Scottish Enlightenment, perhaps? Some scholars say that we should avoid the negative factors that were at work in the Scotland of the late 17th and early 18th century. Nevertheless, when you look at the work of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Adam Smith, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutcheson, you can see in their writings contextual references to the deeper ideas and thoughts and emotions that came out of the havoc of the previous century, and for me are still concurrent with Scottish and political social life today. David Hume's quote, "Where am I, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence, and to what condition shall I return? I am confounded with all these questions." Well, I've been confounded my entire life. And even my own mother inadvertently contributed to my confusion and doubt about my own self-worth, a sense about where I was and who I was and what I was. When I was first married at the relatively too young age of 21, my bride and I decided that no parents would be involved in the marriage ceremony. My wife was relieved not to be embarrassed by her parents, who were very upper middle class, and I was equally relieved not to be embarrassed by my somewhat eccentric mother. But my dear Ma, God rest her soul, decided to write a letter to my prospective mother-in-law. Relatively brief. A letter of qualified recommendation. She wrote, "Brian's no bad laddie. He means well. He's got a good heart, but he's no halfy bright." Prescribed and produced by my own mother. Thank you, Ma. In my mother's letter to my prospective mother-in-law, there was no right of reply. My mother was probably relieved that despite my stupidity, I had landed such a gorgeous, seemingly upper-middle-class wife, but still no right of reply. The parallel to my position as a Scot is that I have no means to say who I am, and my fellow countrymen and women are perhaps in that same situation. Is that the real opportunity of this referendum? We've often been told who we are, who we should be, or what our value is. Maybe this time, in this vote, we get to define ourselves in our own land. As it happens, I don't get the vote. And perhaps some of you in this audience can do it on my behalf. Just as I'm actually powerless to participate in the vote for this country's independence, I've tried to contribute in every way possible, from campaigning to debating to this debate I'm conducting tonight. In a curious parallel, those gentlemen of the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century knew full well that it was pointless to regurgitate the sores and wounds and regret at the loss of their country's sovereignty in the Union of 1707. Instead, they turned their attention to their skill and their intellectual fortitude, like the little boy who couldn't wait to cross the Tay. The Union had taught their countrymen that they were too small, too poor, too stupid to govern them themselves. But the gentlemen of the Enlightenment had the intellectual steel to combat the heart and the heart to explore the ideas of viable independence for their American cousins. Their works travelled across the great ocean. They were embraced by the likes of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and these works became intrinsic to the foundation of the American Revolution. They couldn't do it for their own benighted land, but they could do it for a land 3,000 miles away. And in an oh so typical Celtic fashion, they were on the move. Not physically, but intellectually, morally, ideologically, travelling with undeniable speed and force, a force of restless dimension. 18th century intellectual Scotland was literally fizzing with ideas, and the restlessness was extending towards its own people. Once more, the collective DNA was on the move. In 2006, I was approached by an organisation called the Oxford Ancestors. Now, the CEO of this group was one professor of human genetics, Professor Brian Sykes, and he would ask me if I would submit my DNA to a genetic scrutiny test. I said I would, and I did. I thought he'd have me piss in a bottle and send a urine sample, but he said this was quite unnecessary. It merely required me to swab the inside of my mouth. I was duly sent a swab stick, which I duly returned. After a few weeks, I received a call from Professor Sykes, and I'd virtually forgotten about the whole thing. Professor Sykes went on to explain my DNA. "Well, Mr. Cox, your DNA is very interesting." "Really?" said I. "Oh, yes. Yes, it has very few mutations and is virtually unbroken." "Oh, is that a good thing?" say I. Oh yes, that's very good, very good. It means that your DNA has never deviated from the tribe." "The tribe?" I said. Yes, you've been part of the same tribe for some time." "Oh, interesting," said I. "How long? A couple of 100 years?" "Oh, no, a bit longer." "Well, 1,000 years?" "Oh, no longer." "Well, sorry, I can't guess how long." "I would say about 35,000 years. So, 300 years since the Act of Union seems a drop in the ocean. Has this identity crisis, this feeling of restlessness, this sense that we have to get out of where we are, was this a new thing? Something that really only happened to the Celts in recent times? Why is this sense that we've got to get out of here? Why is it developed? Why was it so strong in the 18th century? Were we running away from a union decision that we couldn't intellectualize? The security, the money, the empire, but in our souls we regretted? We faced a century-long identity crisis, which went deep into who we were and how our society was constructed. The failed rebellions of 1715 and 1745 brought with it the most punitive measures and cruelty that the Highlands of Scotland had ever witnessed. The Prescription Act of 1746, through the banning of the kilt, the wearing of the kilt, the carrying of arms, a systematic attempt to obliterate the Celtic mode of life. The lands of the fallen chiefs were eventually turned over to the factors, who became equally ruthless in the running of the lands and the farms. This resulted in the migration of some and the transportation of others. The clan way of life, which had been in being for over 1,000 years, was systematically being dismantled. Prime Minister William Pitt hit on the idea of raising disaffected clans to serve the British armies overseas by offering the Gaelic Highlander the chance to gain honour in battle, legally wear his Highland dress, play his bagpipes and carry weapons, as his forefathers had done freely for over 1,000 years, but only by joining the official regiments and fighting in British wars for the Empire could they once again obtain their long-cherished cultural practices and traditions. A subtle and powerful incentive for the Gaelic, who for centuries had been warriors. A century before, Daniel Defoe had predicted that Scotland would supply an inexhaustible treasury of men in pursuit of British Empire. This prediction had now become a reality. Another negative example of being told who we are and what our value is. But there was worse to follow. Scotland is not a country, it is a costume. Thus spake the most popular writer of the early 19th century, Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter had rummaged through the chaos of 2 centuries to salvage an idealised candy-floss version of Scotland to promote the visit of King George IV to Scotland in 1842. At one stroke, Scotland had created a fantasised Scotland, romantic, picture book, chocolate box. Scott was a unionist who believed that a mashing up of Scottish history would be more acceptable to his Hanoverian patrons. A travesty of Scottish history, an attempt to turn the hardship, disenfranchisement, loss of life, loss of land, loss of pride, loss of dignity into some kind of Celtic theme park. Scotland would become the playground of the rich. And yet at the same time, the very same time, only 100 miles away, the old way of life, the old Highland way of life, was being dismantled. In 1850, Sir Charles Trevelyan, co-founder of the Highland and Island Immigration Society, which came about as a result of the Highland clearances, wrote to his fellow co-founder, Sir John McNeill. He said, "A national effort would now be necessary in order to rid the land of the surviving Irish and Scotch Celts. The exodus would then allow for a settlement of a racially superior people, perhaps of Teutonic stock, Germans. He welcomed the prospect of flights of Germans settling here in increasing numbers, an ordinary, moral, industrious and frugal people, less foreign to us than the Irish or Scotch Celt, a congenial element which will readily assimilate with our body politic." The view that the economic failures of the Highlands were due to the shortcomings of the Celtic race was shared and expressed by 2 of the most important Scottish papers of the time, the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. It reminds me of a story about Ralph C. Nesbitt, who was, when it was being projected as a possible series for the comedy series for the BBC, the head of the comedy came to London for the pitch, and they were all gathered together, and the pitch was made, and the head of the company says, "Well, you know, the problem is the accent. I mean, just think about Fawlty Towers. Now, would Fawlty Towers work if everybody spoke like Manuel?" Rab C. Nesbitt went on to be the most successful comedy series ever produced by BBC Two. So, in the middle of the 19th century, where do we find ourselves? Scottishness had become a chocolate box fad, fashion for every middle-class English family to come here, chase the deer, watch the Highland Games, a Victorian invention. Our soldiers became the cannon fodder of empire. Empire building became the mode of the day, and the mercenary Scots were placed firmly at the forefront. We had arrived by stealth, deception, finagling to the civilizing project of Great Britain's empire. In his excellent book, and I urge you all to read it if you haven't read it, On the Road to Referendum, Ian McWhirter puts it much better than I ever could. The emotional attachment to the British Empire was itself a political constraint on Scottish radicalism. Socialist leaders failed to understand the tenacity which working people clung to the bitter constellations of their Protestant religion and the racial idealism of the British Empire. The Scottish founder of the British Labour Party, James Keir Hardie, despaired when the workers he'd been lecturing on social internationalism marched off to fight in the British Empire's wars of 1914, ending up in tens and thousands of anonymous graves in France. Fighting for king and country really meant something to these people and their bereaved relatives. But the truth is, the Scots have been dying for other people's wars for a very, very, very long time. My cultural life started at Dundee Rep, 1961, one of the great rep companies in the UK, fortnightly rep. And I was employed as a general factotum. Basically, I had to take the money to the bank, which was the British Linen Bank in the High Street, run messages for the director's secretary, and mop the stage at night. This was my introduction to the theatre, and I loved it. I was as happy as a pig in you-know-what. It was 2 wonderful years working with amazing actors, a theatre which was incredibly vibrant and a privilege of watching and learning. But still hanging over me was this thing of getting to London, because really my Dundonian accent was the one you could cut with a knife. And with the help of wonderful people I met at the time, I scored an audition at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts. I was only 16. I did my audition in London in the May of 1963 and started in the September. I loved London. I still do. It was a hugely exciting place for me. And I did feel free. My arrival in London coincided with one of the great periods of the island's social mobility, the swinging 60s. Tremendous social mobility of the people when people's differences really added to the cultural mix. It was probably the most exciting time ever. Anything seemed possible. And ironically, for me, I started to get a sense of myself as a Celt and as a Scot. I didn't have to protest who I was, I just was. And it dawned on me that my protestations were homegrown. And for me, it only took place when I was back home here. Now, this baffling thought and theme has been with me my entire life. And ironically, this may seem an argument against the yes vote, but bear with me on this. The very notion of independence comes from a position of security. And as a Scotsman, living in Dundee, certainly when it was North Britain, I never had that sense of security. Because my position as a Scotsman wasn't secure. In fact, I was a young man without a nation. My country had been subsumed in the United Kingdom, and I had no say in the matter. Outside of Scotland, I was a Scot, but in reality, an emigre Scot. However spurious, it did give me a sense of identity. The social mobility of the 1960s was very much linked to the re-emergence of the Labour Party and the return of the Wilson government in 1964 with a majority of only 4 seats. I can still remember the feeling in the wake of the Profumo affair that had seriously damaged the previous Conservative government. The feeling that at last, after 13 years of Tory misrule, we were going to get back to the wonderful legacy of the Clare Attlee government of 1945. The government that undertook the nationalisation of public utilities and major industries, with the crowning glory being, Dennis referred to it earlier, the creation of the National Health Service. Sadly, for me, the one element that was missing, and I think it was the element that caused more problems, was education. We never nationalised education, which is what we should have done. Nevertheless, anything at that time looked possible. And as far as social democracy was concerned, everything was on the same page. But the major shift in my political thinking didn't really happen until the beginning of the 90s. And it didn't come through politics. I didn't really think of myself as political. That's only come recently as I've got older. My drive when I was a child was to get away from Scotland. But the irony was that moving away was my way of rediscovering Scotland and rediscovering its richness, its culture. And my final journey towards independence came through Scotland's culture. And it's only recently that I have realised that I was part of this extraordinary cultural renaissance that happened in Scotland immediately after the war. For me, it started in Dundee 53 years ago when I worked at the Red. And I was embraced and taken to the body of the theatre kirk, as it were. I met the most amazing people. Duncan McRae, Glenda Jackson, Peter Gill, fine director, John McGrath, who started the 1784 company. And this was a result of the incredible social mobility of the time, a time which we've never seen again. When I went to drama school, I got a grant from the Scottish Education Authority, a grant on a level that would never be available to a student today. I couldn't believe my luck. When I entered the portals of Dundee Red and found a whole new world, a cultural world, a cultural liberation from a situation that, looking back, I didn't feel at the time was pretty desperate. I wasn't looking forward to leaving school. I didn't know what my future was going to be. Even though I always had this belief I was going to be an actor. But I left, and I was busy for many years, ploughing my own furrow. Busy trying to be an actor, and not just a Scottish actor. To my detriment, I just thought, oh no, I don't really want to buy into all that. And in many ways, I was an idiot. I suppose I was still in the process of exercising the demons of childhood. I didn't, or I couldn't see the obvious. If you met me then, you'd probably deem myself to be a little up myself. I became a London-based actor, ploughing my furrow of discontent, driven on by ambition, trying to cover all the bases. Once again, I was on the move. New York, Los Angeles, London, Stratford, London again, Moscow. And it was in Moscow that I rediscovered the art of the theatre as a constant political voice. For the people of the Soviet Union, if they wanted to find out the truth of what was happening in their country, they wouldn't find it in the newspapers, they would find it in the theatre. And during Perestroika, when I was teaching and directing at the Moscow Arts Theatre, there was almost a hysteria of drama, reflecting the great period of change that was happening in Soviet society. And for me, ironically, the effect was thinking about back home in Scotland. I hadn't acted in the theatre in Scotland for over 20 years. And when I came back to the King's Theatre in Edinburgh to play King Lear in 1991, I was shocked at the sensibility of the audience, the way they took the play to their heart, kind of knocked me for six. I realised that a sea change had occurred in the cultural life of Scotland. Very different from what was going on in the south. More cohesive, a much greater sense of continuity with the work in Edinburgh at the Lyceum, here in Dundee, the work at the Trappist. Whereas theatres had been closing south of the border, here in Scotland, wonderful new theatres were actually opening up, and opening up to great effect. The new Trappist in Edinburgh, Dundee Red, again. The Tramway, the Tron in Glasgow. By stealth, by candidness, by trust, by an amazing sense of community, culturally, Scotland had become independent. Scottish theatre, Scottish art, Scottish music, Scottish design was firmly marked on the international sensibility. A few years earlier, in the midst of farming my discontent, and probably when I was at my personal lowest, I received this advice from my great friend and mentor, again, Fulton McCann. He said, Brian, don't worry about being a star. You're always worried about being a star. Don't worry about your ambition. Don't get caught up in things you have no control over. Just say your prayers and be a good actor. That's the best you can do. And Fulton was right. It was the best I could do. And there was another great friend of mine, the late Kenny Ireland, who recently passed away. He threw me a lifeline. He suggested I come to the Lyceum and direct and act in a production of my choice. And I could perhaps tour it around Scotland. Directing and acting the Master Building in 1994 in Edinburgh, then here in Dundee, Stirling, Glasgow, proved an important step in the direction towards my Scottish emancipation. So culturally, Scotland and I were very much as one. But there was still one nagging problem, which would take me a bit longer to identify. The cultural life of Scotland continued to thrive. The icing on the cake was the opening of the Scottish National Theatre in a most unique and surprising way. It wasn't one theatre, but it opened in several different venues on the same night. An idea of extraordinary simplicity, but an idea that was pluralistic and inclusive, in a way that the National Theatre of Great Britain has only really caught up with. The 90s was really the beginning, or rather the joining, of my cultural and would-be political sensibilities. I became a member of the Labour Party and very much looked forward to bringing down the government that had been so divisive in the economic and social structure of these islands. I mean, what more can be said about Margaret Thatcher that hasn't been said already? An industrial clearance of Scotland was resonant of the clearances of the previous century. With a single sweep of her scythe, she severed the industrial lifeline of Scotland. As part of my political coming of age, I became the voice of the Labour campaign in the 1997 general election. Enough is enough was the main byline of that election. I was very proud to be the part of something, just like your dad. Very proud. Which hopefully would change the paradigm of these islands and reintroduce the magnificent values of those social reforms of 1945, led by arguably the greatest Prime Minister we've seen, Clem Attlee. I was there at the South Bank at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of May 1997. The atmosphere was electric. The Labour Party, my party, got the biggest mandate of the 20th century, 416 seats to carry us into the 21st century. And within 3 months, as a result of the Labour manifesto, Scotland received its parliament back again after an absence of 390 years. The feeling of hope after that election was astonishing. You could almost taste it in your mouth. I was on a high for days. The values that had long been neglected were suddenly going to be dusted off and brought to the fore. But of course, my hope was short-lived. The erstwhile Tony Blair behaved more and more and more and more like a surrogate Margaret Thatcher, leading the country and the party up a cul-de-sac of his own vanity and hubris. Shakespeare says, vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other side. And again, just like the wee boy who wanted to cross the river, I was about to cross another river, a mental river, with a shift in my political thinking. This was to be the final part of my personal homecoming. In the 90s, I'd always been suspicious of the SNP. I thought they belonged to the she and do and the socks brigade, a party whose origins were dubious to say the least. But by the turn of the century, they were becoming a much more viable force in Scotland. But after my disillusion with New Labour in the election of 2011, they emerged as the largest party in Scotland. This is the SNP. And irony of ironies, they emerged equally as the keepers of social democracy. The financial collapse of 2008 brought sharply into focus the struggles between the haves and the have-nots. The chancellorships of Nigel Lawson through to Gordon Brown served to create the deregulated and dysfunctional City of London we have today. Those policies which neglected industry and accepted inequalities of wealth were continued under New Labour, enriching the financial houses who marketed the mortgages, which in turn enriched their wealth through property, which in turn allowed the southern middle classes to consolidate their wealth through property speculation. The average house price in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea is now £2 million, more than twice of that in Scotland. Adam Smith wrote, "The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, on many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it." How true. So, where did that leave me? I had given my allegiance to the very order of such men, and the result was the erosion of social democracy and the principles that sustained my life during the struggle, my struggles as identity as a Scot within this so-called United Kingdom. Nothing changes. We're back to the same old, same old. I've been caught on a circle of repeat events. Decisions have been made on my behalf of myself and my people, which through successive elections we had absolutely no say in. Right from the point of our original union, from the Highland clearances, through Thatcher's industrial demolition, to the phony promises of New Labour. Our rights as freeborn Scots have constantly been defined for us, from union, which put commerce before country, through the Act of Prescription, which put commerce before community. The very essence of our identity changed, often against our will and our better judgment, leading to Sir Walter Scott's characterisation of Scotland as a costume rather than a country. We were cannon fodder or factory fodder, right down today where the Labour Party at Westminster provide lobby fodder. No, we didn't get a say in a union. Those in control made the decision based on their own self-interest. Where did that leave Scotland, the nation, and the people? Our bid for independence isn't to be accused with separation. We are interdependent. Our bid for independence highlights the social disparities that exist south of the border, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the widening gap between north and south, the increasing hegemony of London's financial services, making the city less representative of the regions of the United Kingdom. In fact, when you look at it, over the last years, we've become less and less a United Kingdom, and more a collection of disparate regions. The Westminster Parliament, time and time again, out of touch with its constituents, and can see no further than the end of its own bridge. So the advance of time and disillusion has brought me to my present position. I am a Scot, and proud to be one. And no, Sir Walter, Scotland isn't a costume. It's very much a country. It's been a long time coming, but there it is. And it's only through experience and knowledge of my history and my country's history, meaning really is history, and history really is meaning. Our history as Scots has been very much one of servitude, giving and doing on behalf of others, whether it be the gift of Bible independence from the great Enlightenment thinkers to our American cousins, the gift of militia in the form of Highland regiments for the pursuance of the British Empire and the creation of the British Labour Party under Keir Hardie. Gifts for others. Well, perhaps it's time to gift ourselves. There was something missing in my life. Was it as strong a feeling as being disposed in my own country? Who has taken the decisions? Where is the little man? Whose name is on the front door? Isn't it time it was our own? Alistair Darling castigated a notion of blind faith, but it's all about blind faith. Faith in what we do, faith in ourselves. There was a time when we ourselves had a British construct, but now that doesn't figure anymore, and it figures much less in the city-state of London. In this past, Scotland really mattered in the British narrative. But what about today? Is it the same? After the war, we were united, Scotland and England, by a welfare state. Now we have HS2, which is not seen as unifying the north and south, but stopping in the middle. We are different countries, England and Scotland. We are different countries now with different political discourses. We are not the country of Boris and Dave or Ed or Nick. Our debate and our decision is not being done against England, but a big part of our debate is that Scottish independence can reform in England to restoring social democracy. We're all afraid about something. That's life. Many of us are afraid of this decision. Is it worth it? Does it mean anything? We're caught between so many emotions. But the overwhelming message is, go for it. It's an act of personal faith. Our country needs us, but we also need a country. This is the opportunity not only of our lifetimes, but of many lifetimes. Because the journey here is one for generations. My own family experience tells me that. It is the opportunity to be true to who we are. And that, my friends, is the very essence of enlightenment. So on Thursday, let's say yes.